They have a massive parliamentary majority and they can't do anything with it. So they can't cut spending and they can't really do much on the tax side either.
The overwhelming evidence from other countries that wealth taxes don't raise anywhere near as much as you might expect. But also from the UK, every time the government has tried to raise taxes on wealth through capital gains taxes or very high rates of tax on higher incomes, the revenues have fallen far short of what are expected.
Economically toxic, probably also politically toxic. Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Daniel Freeman, Managing Editor here at the IEA. Today we'll be discussing bond vigilantes, in the gilt sense, not the James Bond sense, the ONS's inability to work out how many people are in the country, and our final budget predictions for next week's just about autumn budget. To do so, I'm delighted to be joined by Christian Niemetz in the studio and Julian Jessup down the line. Thank you both for joining. Also, to viewers, do feel free to like and subscribe to this video. Our first topic is Christian's that Christian picked out, which is a New Statesman article interviewing bond vigilantes.
Yes.
Why did you pick this?
Well, because when I saw the headline, I was convinced, I was sure this was going to be a standard leftist rant about how Britain isn't a real democracy, how it's a dictatorship by the bond markets, because this is something that comes up every now and then, not just from the left, I have to say, but the communitarian right does this as well sometimes. But then I was positively surprised. So the article wasn't actually like that. That wasn't, at least not overtly. It was much more about, well, how participants in the bond markets, how they have become much more aware of what happens in politics, how they have to pay attention to, well, almost political gossip, such as what is the relationship between the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister, whereas there was a time when bond market participants could just afford to be apolitical. And this is ideally what you would want in a country with stable finances. That's what it should be like, being a bond market participant. You should just pay attention to what happens in the business world. And of course, you would pay attention to public finances on budget day when there's a major fiscal announcement. But you wouldn't need to know if there's, say, a prospect of a cabinet reshuffle and what that might mean for what the plan B is, who might replace the chancellor, anything of that sort. So if you, say, buy Swiss government bonds, you probably wouldn't even need to know the name of the federal finance minister. Whereas if you had, say, bought or thought about buying Greek government bonds at the height of the Eurozone crisis, you would very much pay attention to what's the relationship between Varoufakis and Tsipras and what happens exactly, what is the vibe of Varoufakis' Berlin trip and all that sort of thing. And yes, the article was just about how this is in itself an indication of how the fiscal situation has become more unstable, that the bond markets are paying more attention to it. And they are just, it's not that they have a clear policy preference about whether they want to see tax rises or spending cuts or whatever else. It's more that they have the impression that this is a government which, well, firstly, they have a massive deficit and the level of public debt is approaching 100% of GDP. And we have a government that cannot cut spending. Every time they try, they're forced into a U-turn by their own backbenchers. They have a massive parliamentary majority and they can't do anything with it. So they can't cut spending and they can't really do much on the tax side either. Okay, they had this first round of tax increases, but also the promise. Firstly, we won't raise taxes on working people. And then during the first round of tax increases, the promise, I'm only doing this once. I won't come back next year and do the same all over again. And now they've maneuvered themselves into this situation. They can't really do anything on either the spending or the taxation side, or, well, on the tax side, we'll see next week. But this is why bond markets are nervous. And even though the New Statesman in this particular case did not pick up on this idea that that we live in a bond market dictatorship. It is a common theme, comes up every now and then. And it's been a bugbear of mine for quite some time because it's such a misunderstanding of how bond markets, financial markets work. The idea that people in the financial sector have some sort of ideological preference for a small state and for austerity is such complete nonsense. Bond markets are extremely competitive markets. They're almost like commodities markets. These bonds are traded internationally, and no single individual or institution has a major impact on what happens to prices. So this is just determined by a risk assessment, and you could say this is risks are just an objective factor. Some courses of fiscal policy are riskier than others. If people want that anyway, they can have that, but they're going to have to pay a risk premium. And this will be like, and to say that this somehow conflicts with democracy, well, that's not how this works. This will be like, you can have a democratic vote against the weather or against gravity, but that doesn't change anything objectively. And if you have a government that just says, so say, going back to the Tsipras Varoufakis example, if you have a government that says, well, we want to spend without any limit and we don't want to raise taxes either, well then bond market participants are going to price that, and you have objectively a higher risk of them not getting their money back. Of course they're going to demand a risk premium for that.
Yeah. I think on this, it's important to remember that bonds are just a form of debt. So if you want to, it doesn't matter if you're a country or a person, if you want to borrow money from people, you have to convince them to do that. And if you are a less safe bet to lend to, people will tend to only lend money to you on worse terms. Julian, do you have any thoughts on this and the sort of idea that is floating around both on the left and parts of the right that there's something anti-democratic about bond markets?
There's a lot of shooting the messenger going on here. And as you suggested, I mean, the reason why bond markets are so important is because the government itself has decided to spend well beyond its means, and therefore it's had to borrow a lot of money, and it happens to be borrowing it from the bond market. I don't blame the bond markets at all for being sensitive to the announcements that the government is making. On the apolitical point, that is absolutely correct. I mean, I have spent about 30 years working in and around bond markets in one way or another, and bond traders are remarkably neutral, politically, when looking at markets, regardless of the impact on their own personal finances. Indeed, when the Labour government was first elected, there was quite a lot of optimism in financial markets, that finally, here was a government of the so-called grown-ups who are going to be in charge with a big parliamentary majority who are going to, make a decent fist at reforming the public services, particularly the NHS that's costing so much money. That there might be one big round of tax increase in the budget, but then sensible fiscal rules would keep spending under control in the future. Various things. So investors have actually been very disappointed with what's happened under this government. More generally, too, I think there's a risk of blaming the Office for Budget Responsibility here. That's another common theme on both left and right. But that's rather like blaming the referee for a football match for imposing the rules. The referee doesn't decide the rules. The government has said to the OBR, here are the rules, here is what you have to do. And if the OBR finds that very difficult to do, because forecasting 5 years out is very difficult, that's not really the OBR's fault. So at the end of the day, I think it comes back to politicians. They are to blame. And to a degree also, of course, the public that have elected them. The public don't seem to recognize that there are trade-offs here. You can't have big increases in public spending without also big increases in tax. And realistically, it's hard to raise more money from wealth or from richer people. More of that burden is going to have to fall on those at the lower end of the scale, not necessarily those with broader shoulders. So at the end of the day, I actually blame the government for this. I don't blame bond markets. I don't blame the Office of Budget Responsibility either.
Just one quick addition. There are, of course, governments that where public spending is a lot higher than here, but where, say, the governments can nonetheless borrow quite easily on the bond market because there is just a confidence that, if they need to raise taxes, they can do it. So the Austrian government, even though public spending is above 50% of GDP, bond markets don't seem to be particularly nervous about them. Or the Swedish government, they just know, okay, if these guys need to raise taxes, they will be able to do it.
Yeah.
And then you can have a large public sector if that's what people want, and if there's confidence that that's feasible, then and there's no reason why bond markets would have an ideological preference on the large state versus small state side.
Yeah. And I suppose also if you're someone who thinks bond markets are acting sort of as out of political bias against, whether that's against parts of the right or parts of the left or whatever, surely you could make a huge amount of money as a bond trader just by
By being the one apolitical bond trader.
Yeah, you would sort of clear out the whole market just by making.
Well, yeah, it would be the equivalent of, say, an investor in the private sector who bases their investment decision on whether they personally like the product or not. It would be, say, that would of course be a stupid thing to do. If I was an investor, I would happily, say, buy stocks in Carling and Foster's, despite my dislike of the product, but that would not matter to me in that particular situation. And even if I refuse to buy them, well, somebody's going to do it. So they wouldn't even notice it if I boycotted them. And in the same way, if some bond traders had a political bias against a particular government or person within the government or whatever, well, somebody else, if public finances of that government are solid, somebody will buy those bonds.
Yeah. I think one thing that's interesting is in the 2010s, you never really heard about, obviously there was lots of reporting in financial press on bond yields and that sort of thing, but it never really made the BBC news. Since 2022, that has been a pretty constant feature of the British political scene. Sometimes people say, this is all Liz Truss's fault, and we're just living in the sort of post-Truss world, and there's no one else to blame. Do you buy that?
Well, there was, so this argument that somehow bond markets have ideological biases, that came up on the right as well. Just after the Liz Truss meltdown, there were articles, I can't remember where exactly, somewhere on the it was one of the communitarian post-liberal publications where they said, well, we don't really like Liz Truss because she's too much of a liberal for us, but nonetheless, she shouldn't be a democratically elected prime minister, should not be brought down by woke bond traders. And again, this is just a mirror image of the leftist idea. What really happened there was just quite understandably, she had these tax cuts worth about 4% of GDP or so. It would lead to, if nothing else had changed, a long-term increase in the budget deficit, 4% of a year on the basis of those tax cuts alone. They didn't trust her ability to get spending cuts through, because that's obviously the politically difficult part, and that risk was priced in, and there's nothing wrong with that. And but yeah, this was, well, the reason why I guess it mattered more in those circumstances than it would have 5 or 6 years earlier was that this was the post-COVID situation. There was already a massive increase in, firstly, public spending levels, so it never came back down again, and also the public debt level. And under those circumstances, bond markets were more nervous than they were in the previous decade, when you're right, it wasn't really a thing. Then I only remember one article where this was ever, where bond markets and their relationship with politics was ever mentioned, and that was when Labour under Corbyn were still doing well in the polls, and what some of the Corbynites said, well, if we come to power, we will impose capital controls. That was the only time that there was some movement there, and that those people started to think in more political terms. But otherwise, yes, it was just not much of a thing.
Okay. Finally on this, before we move on to our next topic, Julian, how much do you buy the argument that a lot of the sort of instability with bond markets and the higher rates that governments are having to pay for the debt they take out is not so much because of what the UK government is doing, but that the fact globally there is just a lot of government debt floating around. The governments borrowed lots during the COVID period and are still borrowing quite a lot. And that means there's just a lot of supply of bonds and not as much demand. And that's creating problems for the government in the UK that UK governments didn't really create themselves.
Yeah, so if you look at the increase in government bond yields in the UK over the last few years, then the most of that you could actually attribute to the fact that yields have risen everywhere. That's partly, as you say, because the amount of government debt out there is a lot higher. So, investors are demanding higher returns for holding that debt. It's also because official interest rates, short-term interest rates, have returned to more sort of normal levels. So for a long period, they've been very low in many countries, close to zero. And that sort of anchored bond yields at a relatively low level as well. So you've had more debt being issued and also a normalization of short-term interest rates, which have kept pushed yields up. But there are also some other factors that are more specific to the UK, and they're being reflected in the spread between the cost of borrowing in, for example, Germany and the United States, and in the UK. So we have the highest of cost of borrowing in the G7 group of advanced economies, much higher than many other countries. So there's clearly something UK specific going on, and I think there are a mix of factors here. One is that we seem to have lost a bit more credibility than other countries have done. And, the recent U-turns in fiscal policy in the UK are a good example of that. The failure to cut welfare spending, the flip-flopping on income tax, that hasn't helped. So there's an additional political risk premium in there. There's also some things in the structure of the UK government bond market. So we have a relatively large proportion of our debt that is directly linked to the rate of inflation. So when inflation is higher, that has a much more direct effect on borrowing costs here. Our central bank also unusually has been selling government bonds back onto the market and far more aggressively than other central banks have done. So this is what's known as quantitative tightening, the reverse of the previous quantitative easing. And then finally, our inflation has been higher for longer than in other countries, and that's meant the Bank of England has been less willing to cut interest rates. The Labour government likes to make a lot of the fact that we've had 5 interest rate cuts since the general election last year. But other central banks, particularly the European Central Bank, have cut a lot more since then and to a lower level. So higher inflation is contributing not just by raising the direct cost of government borrowing that's linked to inflation, but also it means that short-term interest rates are higher for longer than otherwise as well. So the whole mix of different factors in there, but they're all pretty unhelpful for the UK, which is why we need to be particularly careful to try and restore credibility. And hopefully Rachel Reeves will come up with a more credible fiscal plan next week.
Okay, great. So I think we can move on to our second topic, which is the Office for National Statistics has just released new figures on how many people are leaving the UK. And it's actually quite shocking. Previously, the ONS thought that 77,000 British people had emigrated last year. It turns out the number is over 250,000. So the actual figure is about 3.5 times the initial figure. And this is part of a broader issue that many people have been having with the quality of the ONS's statistics, which play a big role in informing public debate. Christian, do you have any comments on?
Yeah, I would like to see a breakdown of, I know the data doesn't exist yet. I would like to know who these people are and where they are emigrating to. So it could be that this is, so there's always some immigration, say people who retire and buy properties in Spain. If it's just, say, if that was slowed down during the pandemic and there's more of it happening now, then that would be a harmless explanation. But if this is part of a brain drain, if these are, say, ambitious young people leaving, then that would be a problem. So I would really quite like to see who are these people and where are they going to and what are their motivations. And because if there is a strong element of a brain drain, that would have policy implications. That would be especially, I know there have been people on our side of the argument speculating about this, and I don't quite want to do that because there is a danger of, say, projecting your own political motivations into those people, and we just don't know that. But it would not be a massive surprise if it turned out that these are people who just say, well, I can't afford a home here. job market prospects are no longer what they used to be. I'm going to wherever to buy also, and then that would have implications for policy if that's what happens. And otherwise, what it also shows is that so this changes the net migration picture. It shows us, some people on the restrictionist side will sometimes say, well, for me, this is purely about the overall numbers. It's I don't have a problem with immigration. It's just that the numbers are too high. But here you can see that's clearly not how anyone truly thinks about these issues. Because if you have more people emigrating, if you only care about overall net migration levels, then surely it shouldn't matter to you whether you have an increase in immigration or a decrease in immigration. As long as the net migration figures go down, you should then be totally indifferent with regard to that. Turns out nobody is, and nobody treats this as good news, because nobody thinks of this as in, one out terms. If it means that you have a massive population change, people are clearly culturally uneasy about that, and I don't think unreasonably. I don't think there's anything wrong with that preference. I'm just saying, if that's really what people are worried about rather than overall numbers, then we should talk about it in those terms. And stop pretending that this is purely about, do we have enough GPs?
I mean, well, as these figures have resulted in net immigration coming down for last year, but almost exclusive, in fact, I think entirely exclusively, because more people are leaving Britain than we expected, and specifically a lot more British people are leaving. Julian, does this give us any sort of support for the idea that you should, if you have some anecdotal evidence of something happens, maybe you should take it a bit more seriously, even if some of the official statistics are less reliable than we thought?
Yeah, well, I'm a great fan of using data from as many different sources as possible. So often that means using private sector surveys as well as evidence from the official National Statistics Office. But I agree with Christian here. There is a problem. A lot of people looked at these numbers and automatically it sort of confirmed their bias that loads of bright young people are leaving. But one number I would have loved to have had is some sort of age breakdown of the people who are leaving. I think that single number alone would have been really helpful in explaining how worried about this we should be. There's also a possibility that all we're actually doing is measuring the same thing better than we were before. And the big change that the Office of National Statistics has made is that previously they used to try and gauge the number of people leaving the country by basically having people at the borders with clipboards literally asking them. So as a small sample, pretty random, not very efficient. The ONS, to their credit, has improved the way that the statistics are measured. So they've looked at data from the Home Office, for example, or Department of Work and Pensions to see what people are saying about their benefit eligibility or their visa requirements or whatever else that might be. So what we've seen is a better measurement of the data. And it's quite possible that net immigration has always been this high for many years. I suspect it hasn't, but it's possible that it has been, in which case we're not really seeing a big change over the last few years. So the data are consistent with the idea that there's been an accelerating brain drain, but also consistent with other possible explanations. And as you say, this does lead to a sort of broader problem, is that a lot of policy ideally should be evidence-based policy making, but the evidence relies on data, which frankly isn't very good. And we have examples of this all the time. And the COVID inquiry again is throwing up this estimate that 23,000 people died prematurely as a result of delaying the lockdown for a week. And that figure was based on some pretty dodgy modeling that was actually published, I think, in late 2020. That figure could be way wrong, which would have huge implications for what you think the optimal policy might have been. But in the economic field, we've got huge question marks over our labour market data in particular. We don't really know what's happening in the labour market in terms of employment or unemployment, or even we don't really have a good read on wages either, which is making it particularly hard for the Bank of England to decide what the level of interest rate should be, because it rightly or wrongly believes that pay pressures are a key driver of overall inflation. So we're flying blind in lots of areas. I think that is partly due to problems at the ONS that I think are probably now quite well known, and they've been understaffed and had been, I think, quite badly run for a number of years. But there are new people in the ONS now who are rebooting it, and a lot of the changes in the data that we're seeing now, the revisions and so on, are sort of a good thing, really, because they reflect better methods, correcting previous mistakes. And I think we will end up in a better position with economic data and other data on health, migration, and so on than we would otherwise have done.
How much of I'll throw this open to both of you. How much of an issue do you think has the ONS's move to, is it Swansea or Newport? Newport, yes. Newport in South Wales, which is obviously not a massive metropolis. And I think there are statistics that when the initial move happened, they lost 9 out of 10 of their senior statisticians. Do you think this is playing a particular role in their inability to sort of crunch the data properly, or is it more of an issue with the collection of the data?
I think there are a number of problems here. I'm willing to believe that the move to Newport has played a small part, but you would hope in the modern era that with remote working and so on, particularly with statistics, that wouldn't be such a big problem. I think the issues go a bit broader than that. And one thing a lot of people don't seem to appreciate is that the ONS itself doesn't actually collect an enormous amount of data. It's very reliant on figures provided by other government departments. So, for example, there was a mistake recently with the inflation numbers, which is very unusual, but that's because the Department for Transport, as was, provided inaccurate figures on vehicle excise duty. So I think it's a broader problem, the quality of statistics across government. I wouldn't just blame the ONS for this. But within the ONS, I think there are some problems. I think they've been distracted over the last few years, just trying to be a bit too clever in some areas. So they publish loads of peripheral data from other sources, like the number of ships docking at British ports and so on, which we could probably find from somewhere else if you wanted to. But I think they have lost a little bit of sight on their sort of core roles of getting the big numbers right. But as I say, there's a new team in charge that are refocusing on getting things better. And I'm quite optimistic that over the next few years, a lot of these problems will be fixed.
Yeah, I think in this case, it's really primarily a data collection issue. So I remember I saw some of these people once at Heathrow or Gatwick, where they're standing around with their clipboard and trying to stop passengers who are in a rush. Some of them are rushing to the gate and others are rushing to the Wetherspoons, and they're trying to grab them and say, wait, where are you going and why? And I thought, is this really the best way to collect that kind of data? Especially when I read later from the Migration Observatory that really the immigration figures are really based on these surveys. And well, if that's the data you get, that's probably pretty thin, and there's not much to work with. So the move to more administrative data, that clearly makes sense. And I think in this case, what they should do is simply connect with, say, ask the Home Office in Australia or in Dubai or wherever, and ask them, have you issued more work visas to British nationals? And if so, is there anything you can tell us about those people without violating any data privacy concerns?
Yeah, just another good example of the clipboard problem is how the ONS used to collect the inflation numbers. So again, it literally had people going around a random selection of shops with clipboards recording the prices on the shelves, which probably 10, 20 years ago was absolutely fine. But of course, nowadays, you've got all sorts of complications. You've got, for example, discount cards. You've got shrinkflation, where, it looks like the same bar of chocolate, but it's a lot smaller than it was before. That's not necessarily obvious from looking at prices at the on the labels on the shelves. But again, this is an area where the ONS is improving things. It's collecting more data directly from the tills electronically. In other words, picking up the prices that people are actually paying. And it'd be very interesting to see what impact that has when that washes through the data. I expect it won't be a huge impact, but it could be. And again, that'll be another area where the government is making decisions, or the Bank of England is making decisions on data that's actually pretty flawed.
Okay, well, on that slightly sobering note, let's move on to our final topic, which is also pretty sober and pretty dour, because our final topic is next week's budget. the second that Rachel Reeves has announced. And so what we're all going to do is come up with some predictions for next Wednesday. What taxes are going to go up? Are there going to be any spending changes? And then we can all laugh at ourselves when we all turn out to be wrong. So to do this, I'm going to start with Julian. What would be your top budget predictions?
Okay, well, first of all, in terms of the overall size of the tax increases, I've come up with a number of 30 billion. And that will almost certainly be wrong, but hopefully I'm going to be wrong in a fairly sophisticated way, because I built that up from assumptions about productivity, about the amount of fiscal headroom, and also some of the economic assumptions the OBR might be making, and some of the spending increases that Rachel Reeves will undoubtedly include. So a figure of 30 billion, I think, is a reasonable guess. In terms of how she will fill that gap, I'm assuming 10 billion will come from a broad-based increase in income tax, most likely now by extending the freeze on tax thresholds rather than raising income tax rates. But that still leaves 20 billion that will come from what some people are describing as a smorgasbord of lots of little measures, but I prefer to describe as a dog's breakfast. So these are lots of little tiny things in the bigger scheme of things on wealth, on non-employment income, some forms of spending, that sort of thing. Now, the problem with relying on all those little things is that the economic impact of that is highly uncertain. The behavioral effects will be much bigger. It's easy to avoid them by changing their behavior. And also, therefore, the revenues raised from that are a lot less certain as well. So I don't think the markets would like that. The markets want certainty, and a sort of massive package of individual measures that individually might only raise a couple of billion, I think is actually going to go down quite badly in the markets.
Yeah.
So my big fear is that she won't really end up ending the uncertainty that's overhanging not just the markets but also households and businesses. And I don't think she really will convince people that this is going to be the last time she has to come back with big tax increases.
Yeah. With the smorgasbord or dog's breakfast approach, is there also a political risk that you get into the same situation as George Osborne did with the famous omnishambles budget, where if you hit small specific interest groups really hard, they're much more likely to kick up more of a fuss? And conversely, is that potentially a good thing from the economy's point of view? Is that you present a 20 billion pound smorgasbord, but then eventually within 3 months that gets whittled down to 15 billion or 10 billion?
Yeah. Well, the number of aspects. I mean, first of all, not only is the impact of these smaller changes going to have a disproportionate impact on a relatively small number of people who are bound to kick up a bigger fuss, there's also a bigger risk that those sorts of measures unravel in the following days. I mean, we referred to George Osborne's 2022 omnishambles budget. I mean, that could prove to be a masterpiece in comparison to what we might be getting next week. So lots of individual things that she's going to do that people like me and tax experts more generally are going to dissect, and they might quickly unravel. But in a sense, she's got two bad choices here. One is to raise taxes from potentially a relatively small number of people who are going to kick up a bigger fuss as a result, or to go for broad-based tax increases where everybody bears some of the burden. And she sort of hinted at that in her scene-setting speech on the 4th of November, when she said words to the effect of all of us will have to contribute to that effort. Now, in economic terms, that might actually be quite sensible. Just whack 2 or 3p on income tax across the board. You get a reasonably certain amount of money, and it's a single measure that everybody can understand. But politically, of course, that's nigh on impossible because of the commitments that Labour made in the manifesto in 2024 not to raise income taxes in this way. So she's stuffed, really. I'm afraid the rest of us might be as well. What she should do economically might be clear, which is, first of all, you cut spending, and secondly, if you need to raise more money, do it from a simple increase in income tax or VAT. But politically, her hands are tied. And that's a remarkable thing to say when the government was only elected a year or so ago with such a massive parliamentary majority.
Okay, Christian, what are you looking out for in the budget and expecting?
Well, Julian, you said you're going to be wrong in a sophisticated way. Let me be wrong in an unsophisticated way. My prediction is less about an actual policy. It's more about a presentational aspect. So I remember about 10 years ago, there was the living wage campaign, which was a massive thing, or I think it was several campaigns. And George Osborne at the time wanted to appeal to those groups without introducing an actual living wage, because that would have been just too close to the median wage, and it would have been unaffordable for a lot of companies. So what he did was he just hiked the minimum wage and called that new minimum wage the living wage. Of course, some of the people, some of the campaigners were furious and said, but this isn't the living wage. But nonetheless, it was not a copyrighted term. So he could say, well, I'm calling this the living wage, sue me. And I could imagine that they will do something a bit like that on the wealth tax this time. So they will not introduce a wealth tax. But there will be something, could be a mansion tax, could be an additional rate of council tax. That's already been sort of soft leaked. Something like that will probably happen. I could imagine that they would present this, that they will not quite call it, this is the wealth tax, but they will describe it in the terminology that you would use to talk about wealth taxes. They will say this is about making sure that the wealthy pay their fair share, and the wealthy, those with the broadest shoulders and all that kind of rhetoric. So they will do something like that and use the Zach Polanski, Gary Stevenson rhetoric in the hope that this will win over some of the people who might otherwise be swayed by those people, which of course it won't, but I could imagine them trying.
Yeah. Okay, so would this be sort of there was this floated suggestion of just essentially doubling council tax on the top two bands of council housing?
Yes, something like that. Yes.
And then say, oh, look, we've introduced a wealth tax.
Yeah.
Please leave us alone now. Yeah, I mean, could you go into some detail about why that would be really, really bad?
Well, it would be less bad than an actual wealth tax.
Okay.
But it would just be a fairly arbitrary way of raising money. So what I would generally do, it's true to say that it was probably a bad idea to decouple council tax from the underlying property value. It was introduced as a property tax. It was in 1991. It's just that then we had this massive explosion in property prices and massive divergence, and council tax was uprated in a completely different way, much more in a haphazard, ad hoc way, just individual councils saying, well, this year it's going to be this much. And within tight confines of national guidelines. So bringing council tax more into line with underlying property prices, that would not be a bad idea. It's just that when you do that now, then you have the problem, we talked about this before here, that, well, if you said, we'll uprate it, we will update the valuation now, and it's gone up 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. That would mean for at least for some people an explosion in the council tax bill, and that's not the way you'd want to do it. But more generally, having, say, property taxes, it can be done in a revenue neutral way. Property taxes that are more closely linked to actual property values. That's a good thing, because then you make it more like, say, paying for services that you receive. And if you just say, well, we'll introduce a mansion tax or something like that, well, then you don't have that effect. You're just singling out an unpopular group, and you're just overcharging them.
Yeah.
If I could just add to that, I think Christian is absolutely right. A lot of the tax increases in this budget will be presented as taxes on wealth, if not necessarily called a wealth tax. And there are a number of other things in addition to higher rates of tax on higher value properties that she might do. So there are suggestions that she might look at some sort of exit tax, which would actually take the form of capital gains tax on unrealized business assets when you leave. I mean, she might look at some forms of reducing some of the tax breaks on saving, or making some of the tax breaks on inheritance tax look less favorable. So she'll come up with a mixture of different things here. But the problem is that none of these would get anywhere near the sort of magical figures of 10 or 20 billion that are being proposed by the likes of Zach Polanski on a proper wealth tax. She won't do a proper wealth tax, as others would call it, simply because nobody thinks it would work. There's overwhelming evidence from other countries that wealth taxes don't raise anywhere near as much as you might expect. But also from the UK, every time the government has tried to raise taxes on wealth through capital gains taxes or very high rates of tax on higher incomes, the revenues have fallen far short of what are expected. So I think we'll end up in sort of messy middle ground of lots of so-called taxes on wealth, but raising nowhere near as much as some of the fantasists would suggest. And each of those individual measures as well, I think, could well backfire. If we take a mansion tax or an increase in the higher rates of council tax, what do you do with people who are asset rich but cash poor? So lots of people maybe living in London or the southeast of England who might be living in a relatively expensive home but don't necessarily have the extra money to pay a bill. It's been suggested that they might be able to roll that into the value of the house when they eventually sell it. But that will create a disincentive to sell the house. It gums up the property market even further. And again, it sort of undermines the flexibility of the housing market, but also the labor market and everything else. It means the housing market is not used as efficiently as it could be.
Yeah. And also with this policy specifically, by linking it just to doubling the rate of council tax for G and H class houses, there's not necessarily a huge gap between a house that's rated as F and one that's G. So you might end up in a weird situation where the value of houses that are sort of classed as the second highest end up losing a load of value because people realize that you're going to pay higher taxes on them.
Well, it's a good example of how the devil is in the detail. I think it would be better to do this if you wanted to through council tax rather than a brand new mansion tax, because then at least you're not setting up a new system. But you still have to look at how you're going to revalue housing. Where are the new bands going to be set? And I think it might be maybe several years before this new system takes effect. Now, that's fine as far as the fiscal rules are concerned, because as long as you get the money in towards the end of the forecast period, that is good enough. And it does at least mean that people's tax bills may not go up straight away. But the revenues that you're going to raise from this and the broader economic impact is far less certain than the impact from simply raising income tax, which would be a much cleaner solution.
And then, well, with the revenues start only coming in, say, 2029, then you're in the issue that you've just hit people with a massive tax increase right before you have to hold an election, which the Chancellor may not be keen on doing.
On the other hand, I think Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer would be delighted if they're still in the position in a few years' time where that's a problem.
Well, yeah, that may be luxury problems at this stage. Okay, I'm going to make one prediction which I have kind of not very high confidence in, but I think it could deal with some of the issues that that they're just not going to raise enough for what they want to do with a threshold freeze. So I think we shouldn't rule out the possibility of some thresholds being decreased. So there was talk about reducing the threshold for paying the higher rate of income tax down to 46,000. And even suggestions that you reduce the additional rate, the 45p rate, down to 100,000. Now, I think that would be a really bad move in the sense, especially at the 100,000 rate, this would increase the massive cliff edge that people already face from the withdrawal of the personal allowance and end up putting up marginal rates of effective tax to over 70% and just add to the disincentives to work. But it would look pretty good on a Resolution Foundation distribution chart. And from the last 15 years of British politics, that seems to be the one of the surest ways of predicting if a tax raise comes into force. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say we'll see some threshold decreases, not just freezes.
Yeah, so you're saying Britain isn't really run by bond vigilantes, it's by the Resolution Foundation.
Yes.
We'll get you closer, at least.
Yeah. Any objections to that, or?
Well, there's obvious political objection to it. I think people immediately crunch the number of people who will now be paying higher rates of tax for the first time. So if I recall correctly, already something like 10 million people are or soon will be paying that higher rate of income tax. If you lower that threshold to to 46,000, which has been suggested, I think, by some Labour figures as the sort of dividing line between working people and whatever the alternative to working is supposed to be. But then you'd be hitting another enormous swathe of people on actually pretty modest incomes. Like I can see the headlines, a senior nurse will now be paying a higher rate of tax for the first time and so on. So I think whatever the economic arguments, and you could argue that either way, depending on what you think the alternative way of raising the money is, I think politically that would be extremely toxic.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably going to be the watchword for the whole budget. Economically toxic, probably also politically toxic, but we will find out next Wednesday, and we will be back in the podcast room next Friday to discuss what we got right, got wrong, and more importantly, what the Chancellor got right, maybe, but probably mostly wrong. Anyway, thank you, Julian, for joining us down the line. Thank you, Christian, for joining us in the studio. Thank you, listeners, for joining us wherever you are. Do remember to like and subscribe to this channel, give us 5 stars, and follow our Substack. Links in the description. So until next time, see you.